The letter came on a Thursday, which she always thought was a strange day for a life to change. She had been sorting through the last of her mother's things when Meredith from the post office came up the walk. Meredith didn't usually deliver. She came herself when the news was the kind that needed a face attached to it. So when she saw the woman coming through the gate with the envelope held carefully, like something that might break, she already knew it would not be simple. It wasn't. Her mother's cousin had died in the autumn, out west near the Saskatchewan border, and had left behind a trading post and a piece of land and a debt that was, by the accounting of the letter, considerable. The cousin had no children, no wife. There was a nephew somewhere, the lawyer wrote, but the nephew had not been located, and until he was, the property required someone to keep it from falling entirely to ruin. There was a man already on the land. He had worked with the cousin for 3 seasons, knew the store, knew the territory. He had agreed to stay on through the winter, but the post needed someone to run it properly, someone with a claim to the estate, and she was the only one who could be found. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table and looked out the window at the November yard and thought about her mother, who had been dead for 6 weeks, and her husband, who had been dead for 2 years, and the house she was standing in, which she could not afford to keep through another winter on her own. She wrote back the same evening. She said she would come. The train ride took 4 days. She had 1 trunk, a canvas bag, and a copy of a seed catalog she had picked up at the station in Winnipeg without knowing why. She read it on the long, flat stretches where there was nothing outside the window but snow and sky, and the occasional stand of spruce looking thin and cold in the distance. She read about squash varieties and heritage tomatoes and the proper wintering of garlic, and she tried to imagine what the land out there would look like in summer, whether it would be anything she recognized. She had grown up in Ontario. She knew apple orchards and limestone fences and rivers that ran brown in the spring. She did not know this. She did not know what the soil would hold, or how long the season ran, or what the wind would do to things. She was 31 years old, and she was going to a place she had never seen to run a store she had never been in, and the only thing she felt clearly was that it was better than the alternative, which was nothing. The man met her at the station in Lloydminster. She recognized him because he was the only one standing outside in the cold who didn't look like he was waiting for a train. He looked like he was waiting for something he wasn't sure about. He was taller than she'd expected, though she hadn't expected anything specific. His coat was good but old. He held his hat in his hands, which she thought was either respectful or nervous, and she couldn't tell which. She said she supposed he was the one from the post. He said he supposed she was the one from Ontario. They didn't shake hands, she didn't offer, and he didn't either, and somehow that was fine. He took her trunk and put it in the back of the wagon without being asked, and she climbed up herself without waiting to be helped, and they drove the 12 miles out to the property, in a silence that was, she thought, at least honest. The trading post was not what she had pictured. She had pictured something small and orderly. What she saw was a low building made of squared logs that had gone gray with weather, a lean-to shed attached on one side that leaned more than it should, a woodpile that was adequate but not generous, and a store window in which someone had placed a single tin of peaches on the sill, as though for decoration. Behind the post was the land, flat in some directions and rolling in others, with a frozen creek running along the eastern edge and a stand of poplar to the north that broke the wind in winter, she would later learn. There were outbuildings, there was a well, there was a kitchen garden plot that had been turned over in the fall, but not properly, the rows still lumpy and irregular, frost heaving the edges of things. She stood in the yard for a moment and looked at all of it. The man waited. He didn't try to explain or excuse it. He just stood with his hands at his sides and let her look. She said finally that she'd like to see the inside. He said that was fair. The store was better than the outside had suggested. The shelves were full and organized, not haphazardly, but with intention. Dry goods on one side, hardware on the other, the small medicines and tobacco and writing papers near the counter where they could be watched. The floor had been swept recently. The ledger on the counter was open, and the handwriting in it was clear and regular. She ran her finger down a column without asking, and he didn't say anything, just watched her. She looked at the numbers, incoming and outgoing, credits and debts. Her mother's cousin had not been a careless man with the inventory, but he had been careless with the credit he extended. And there were names in the ledger beside amounts that ran long. Some of them ran very long. She asked who these were. He went through them. He knew each name, each circumstance, each reason the account had grown. This one had a sick wife. This one had lost cattle in the late blizzard. This one was simply a man who did not pay and had not paid in 3 years. And the cousin had kept extending credit out of what the man described, without judgment, as stubbornness or kindness. He couldn't say which. She listened to all of it. She didn't write anything down because she didn't need to. She had her mother's memory, which was a good one, and she had learned years ago that writing something down let you forget it, and she didn't want to forget any of this yet. When he finished, she asked about the suppliers. He told her. She asked about the winter regulars, who came in reliably, who came in when they needed something specific, who came in just to come in. He told her that too. She looked around the store once more, at the peaches on the windowsill and the neatly stacked bolts of cloth and the rifles in the rack on the wall, locked. She asked what he thought the post needed most. He says he thought it needed someone who'd stay. She looked at him then. He was looking at the floor. She said she intended to. The first weeks were hard in the way that new things are always hard. Not terrible, just unfamiliar, which has its own particular weight. She learned the store. She learned the routes the regulars took, which roads were passable, in which conditions, which families sent the children in with a list, and which families came in together. She learned the smell of the cold when it came through the door, and how long it took the wood stove to recover. She learned him, too, in the way you learn someone when you are working alongside them every day in a small space. He was quiet, not unfriendly, but economical. He used words the way some people use money, carefully and for specific purposes. He knew the land around the post, the way she knew her mother's house, room by room, which boards creaked and where the light came through. He could read the weather 3 days out, she discovered, without knowing how he knew it. He just said once, before a storm that closed the road for 4 days, that they ought to bring in extra wood, and she had, and they had been fine. She noticed that he noticed things, that he refilled the water barrel before she thought to ask, that when the stovepipe started drawing poorly, he fixed it on a Saturday before the cold Sunday, not after, that he watched the road the way you watch something you've watched for a long time, not with worry but with attention. She did not say any of this to him. She filed it away in the same place she filed everything, and she kept going. The trouble with the accounts came in February. A man named Sutter, she'd been told about him but not met him, as he sent his daughter in for supplies, came in himself on a cold Tuesday with a look on his face that she recognized from her years running her husband's affairs. It was the look of a man who had decided what he was going to say before he got there, and was hoping she'd agree quickly so he wouldn't have to say more. He told her the account had been running on an understanding he'd had with the cousin, that the cousin had told him the debt was something that could be settled over time, slowly, without pressure, that he expected the same understanding to continue. She listened to all of it. Behind her, she heard the other man stop what he was doing, which was stacking a new order of lamp oil, and go still. She said she understood what he was describing. Sutter said good. She said she would honor the existing schedule, the one that was written in the ledger, which showed a payment due in March and another in June. Sutter said the schedule had been more flexible than that. She said the ledger was what she had. There was a silence. Sutter was not a small man, and he stood with his weight forward in a way that was probably habit and probably not intended to be a threat, but she had seen enough of the world to know what weight like that usually meant. She held his eyes and waited. He took his goods, and he left without saying more. She listened to the wagon go down the road, and then she heard the other man resume stacking the lamp oil, quietly, as though nothing had happened. She let out a breath she hadn't decided to hold. That evening he made tea without being asked, which he had not done before, and set a cup on the counter beside her without comment. She drank it, and they worked in a silence that was, she thought, different from the silences before. Slightly warmer, not by much, but enough to notice. Spring came late, which she had been told to expect, but did not fully believe until she saw the middle of April, and there was still snow in the poplar stand to the north. but it came. The creek ran loud for 2 weeks and then settled. The road turned to mud and then dried. Kitchen garden, which she had redug in the first warm days, began to show green at the edges of the rows. She had planted it differently than it had been planted before. Closer rows, different organization. The squash at the south end, where it would catch the most sun in the short summer. He had watched her do this without comment on the first day. On the second day, he had helped, taking the other end of the string length line without being asked. She had not thanked him. He had not expected to be thanked. They had just worked. The lean-to shed was the next thing. It leaned because 2 of the support posts had rotted at the base, which she saw the first week and thought about for 2 months before deciding what to do. She asked him, one morning over the ledger, whether he knew how to set new posts. He said he did. She asked whether he had time on Saturday. He said he had time on Saturday. They replaced the posts and squared the shed up in a single day. He mixed the concrete for the footings. She held the posts level while he braced them. They did not talk much while they worked. She found she didn't need to. What she had learned in those months was that there were 2 kinds of quiet. There was the quiet that was absence. No connection, no awareness, just 2 people in the same space with nothing between them. And there was the quiet that was presence, both people aware of the other, working toward the same thing, saying what needed to be said when it needed to be said, and leaving the rest alone. His quiet was the second kind. She had known it for a while, but the shed was when she was certain of it. The summer brought more business than the ledger had shown the previous year. She had written letters in the winter, carefully and without fanfare, to 3 new suppliers. One in Regina, one in Edmonton, one through a catalog she'd found, folded into a drawer of the back room. She had renegotiated the terms with 2 of the existing suppliers based on what the ledger showed about order frequency. She had extended credit to a family named Leclerc, who had arrived from Quebec the previous fall and were setting up a quarter section 3 miles east. She had refused credit to 2 others, politely and in writing with clear explanations. She had also repainted the store window frame and replaced the glass in the north-facing window, which had been cracked since before she arrived. She had put nothing on the windowsill. She thought the tin of peaches had been a kind impulse on someone's part, but that a clean window let in more light, and light was more useful. By midsummer, the Lloydminster paper ran a small item, 4 lines, about the post. A correspondent described it as one of the best-kept trading operations in the territory. She read it once and then used the paper to start the stove. He saw her do it. He said nothing, but she thought she saw something in his face. Not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it. She asked what. He said she could have kept it. She said she had read it. He said that was true. She looked at him for a moment, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything else, and she turned back to the stove, and that was that. The nephew arrived in September. He came by wagon from the north, unannounced, with a letter from the lawyer, and an expression that was part apology and part calculation. And she recognized the calculation immediately. He was perhaps 24. He had the cousin's jaw, and none of the cousin's patience, as far as she could tell. He looked around the post with the specific expression of a man who has inherited something and is wondering what it is worth. He told her he was entitled to the estate. She said she was aware of that. He said he supposed she'd done a reasonable job of keeping the place. She said she had done more than keep it, and she said it in a tone that was not unkind but was exact. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the garden through the window and the repaired shed and the new shelves she'd built along the back wall in May. He looked at the account book, which showed a surplus over the same period the previous year. He was quiet for a while. The other man was in the store, organizing a delivery. He moved carefully, the way he always did, without drawing attention, but she knew he was listening. The nephew said he supposed he had a decision to make. She said she supposed he did. He spent 3 days. He slept in the back room. He spoke to customers who came in, some of whom she had introduced to the post, and some of whom had come since the early winter, when word had begun to spread that the operation was well run. He rode out to the eastern quarter with the other man one afternoon, and she watched them go from the store window. On the evening of the 3rd day, the nephew sat down at the counter with the ledger and a piece of paper and wrote out an offer. He was willing to sell her the property, the post, the buildings, the land, for a figure that reflected the debt still outstanding against the estate. Not generous, but fair. He needed the cash more than the land, he said, and he thought she'd make more of it than he would. She looked at the number. She thought about the letters she had sent in the winter, and the accounts that had begun to settle, and the garden, and the shed, and the window glass, and the 4 lines in the Lloydminster paper that she had burned. She said she needed until morning. He said that was fine. She did not discuss it with the other man that evening. She did not think it was his decision. But after supper, when she was washing the basin and he was banking the stove for the night, he said, without looking up, that the north quarter had good drainage. He said it had looked good in spring, and he thought it would be reliable. He said the soil east of the creek was deep. He didn't say anything else. He went out to the shed, and she stood at the basin for a moment and thought about reliable and deep. In the morning she told the nephew she would take it. The nephew left on a Tuesday. He was not unkind in the end. He helped load his own things onto the wagon, which she thought said something about him, and he shook her hand at the end in a way that was genuine. And he told her she had done something real out there, which was the first time anyone had said it to her plainly, and which she was not quite prepared for. She watched him go until the wagon was small on the road, and then she went back inside. The other man was at the counter with the ledger. He had opened it to a new page and was writing the date at the top. She stood beside him and looked at the clean white page. She asked whether he intended to stay. He said he had nowhere else particular to be. She said that wasn't what she asked. He set the pen down. He looked at the page for a moment, and then he looked at her, and she held it, the way she had held Sutter's eyes in February, except that this was entirely different. He said yes. He intended to stay. She nodded. She picked up the pen and added a number in the first column of the new page. He watched her do it, and then he opened the supply drawer and took out the ink cloth and began to do the thing he'd been meaning to do all morning, which was re-ink the stamp for the outgoing mail. They worked until the light went thin. The winter came in November, which she had been told to expect, and she was ready for it. The wood was in. The accounts were settled to a point she thought sustainable. The Leclerc family from the East Quarter had brought in 24 eggs as a gift, which she had not expected, and she had sent back a tin of good tea, which she thought was the right reply. She had learned to read the land by then, or the beginning of it. She knew which way the snow would drift, which corner of the yard to watch for ice, how the light looked in the morning when the cold was the serious kind. She knew the sound of the creek in November and December, and she was beginning to know the difference between them. She knew him too, in the way that is difficult to describe because it accumulates rather than announces itself. She knew how he took his tea, and which problems he'd sit with before saying anything, and which ones he'd bring to her right away. She knew that he trusted her judgment without requiring her to earn it constantly, which was not nothing. She knew he had lost someone a few years back, though he had not said so in plain words and she had not asked. She knew it the way you know a winter that's been hard, not from what's said but from what's been held. She thought he probably knew the same sort of things about her. They had not spoken about any of it. They did not need to. There was the work, and there was the land, and there was the particular silence between two people who have chosen the same thing and know it, and that was enough. It was, she thought, more than enough. It was the kind of thing most people spent their whole lives looking for and named wrong when they found it. She came in from the garden one afternoon in the last week of November, stamping the mud from her boots on the step, and she looked through the window before she opened the door. He was behind the counter entering numbers in the ledger with the same careful hand she had noticed on the first day. The wood stove was going, and the light was warm, and the shelves were full, and outside the first real snow of the season was beginning to come down slow and level across the yard. She stood on the step for a moment and let herself look at it. Then she opened the door and went in, and the bell above the frame rang once, and he glanced up, and she pulled off her coat and put it on the hook and went to see what the afternoon mail had brought. The snow kept coming, covered the garden and the shed and the road and the long flat land in every direction, and by evening it had quieted everything down to just the sound of the stove ticking, and the wind finding the corners of the building, and now and then one of them saying something that needed to be said.